Good morning and welcome to Grain Trade Australia's virtual event today. GDA is very proud to present this summit. The theme for today is modernising the grain supply chain from drought through COVID-19 to 2030. As we all know, investment in the grain supply chain has to a degree not kept up with the modernisation that has been occurring in other parts of the economy, both here in Australia and around the world over the past decade. Our competitors continue to invest in large rail, port and intermediate infrastructure. That means their supply chain costs have lowered significantly while ours has remained quite stagnant. The outcome of the strategy will hopefully lead to more sustainable, efficient and globally competitive Australian grain supply chain that will ultimately improve farm gate value back to growers. GTA members are an important and vital link in the grain supply chain. We have a great lineup of guest speakers for today's summit who will outline and elaborate on GTA's vision to innovate growth and investment. Our speakers come from a broad section of the supply chain, those who are an important part of receiving, sampling and moving grain to those whom provide the backroom technology that follows each load of grain all the way from paddock to customer, whether that be domestic or export. We're also very pleased to have David Ironside, Assistant Secretary for Plant Export Operations, here with us today from the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, to outline the government's extended view and a strategic plan for their vision into 2030. We believe the two strategies are well aligned and have synergies that can help to reinvigorate the whole grain supply chain towards 2030. We hope the GTA and government can continue to work closely to try and achieve this. I hope you all have a terrific day and manage to come away with some clearer thinking and strategic ideas on the improvements that can be achieved throughout the whole supply chain. Improvements across the supply chain will add value to every tonne of grain in Australia. I'd now like to introduce Pat O'Shannessy, CEO of GTA. Pat has been instrumental in the formation of the From Drought Through COVID-19 to 2030 strategy document, and I'm sure you'll find his short introduction very informative. Welcome, Pat.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I didn't want to be the first person to start talking on mute, so hopefully we'll work through that. I'm just going to share my screen here a little bit and try and move that across there. So just to go back a little bit, just to quickly run through the program that we've got there around sort of the key things we'll outline today. So it's pretty action-packed, I suppose you'd call it, and we will be trying to make sure that we stay on time around that. So we'll work through that. We're looking at the overview, some around assessment technology, some storage assets is one of the topics for the day. The IT side of things, and we've got Emma Weston here to talk to us about IT. And then we'll also talk about the global frameworks and around trade and market access as well, and finish up with a chat about logistics and how we can move forward there. I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the genesis, if you like, of what we're calling our modernising the grain supply chain and how that came about. Now, through our technical committees, you will be familiar with those processes. We were hearing a lot of ideas, issues, observations, if you like, around the grain supply chain and some of our own observations, and really could sort of see that industry wasn't, let's not say struggling, but how do we capture and keep moving forward as an industry, as Andrew touched on, with the world around us moving ahead as well. So we saw a number of these things, and when we really sat down and thought about it, it was all about the supply chain, whether it was at a technical level or a logistical level around that. So running through that and expanding on that a little bit, talking about the complexity of our supply chain. So I think most of us involved in it and have been in there know that it is complex, and know that it's an unusual supply chain as well because of the commingling and the joint asset owners around it. So that has made it difficult at a industry level, if you like, around pushing forward and developing and strengthening the efficiencies within that. The other thing that I think is quite interesting around our supply chain is what we found is the first mover advantage, if you like, can be quite limited. And we'll touch on this a bit more as well during the day. But due to the strong competition and I think the shared approach and the fact that most of the efficiency that gets driven through the supply chain will get competed away back down to the hip pocket of the growers to a large extent, that has made investment in the supply chain quite difficult, I think, in many cases, and certainly in terms of optimising the supply chains. And the fact that we have, really we talk about a grain supply chain, but within that there's obviously a number of different supply chains around working through that. So we saw that as an industry issue. Our supply chain in the Australian grains industry is quite different. It's going against grain. Normally what you'd see is consolidation, scale being built to drive efficiency through a supply chain. And what we've really seen in the grains industry, particularly since deregulation, is a bit of a fragmenting, if you like, of our supply chain. So we're sort of wondering about how do we maintain the reputation, if you like, well-earned reputation for quality assurance, safe food, safe green product coming out of Australia through our grain supply chain. So obviously the growth in on-farm storage, particularly on the East Coast, and a number of smaller operators from our traditional bulk handlers has meant that supply chain is fragmenting. So that's a bit of a challenge at an industry level. And I put there a little picture of the code of practice there as what I would sort of term as kind of the glue that's holding the whole thing together. But we need to think about that at an industry level as well. And then, no surprise to anyone, but the world's obviously, and the grains industry in terms of competition, an awful lot of it. And more and more of that emerging out of the Black Sea, even in our traditional exporters as well, out of the US, Canada. Argentina's making a bit of a comeback of late as well. So that competition there means that investment in our supply chain is very important to maintain our edge and continue to deliver benefits. On the cost side, I think many of you will have seen a couple of those pictures there, borrowed from an AGIC report around how the Australian supply chain stacks up internationally versus the Black Sea versus Canadians versus the US and so forth. And, I think what we all understand is that, we're not got one arm behind our back, but we've got a bit of work to do in terms of maintaining our competitiveness there. I put there a little picture of there was a picture there of the supply chain in India. And just as a small reminder of saying, well, that's where we don't want to be, obviously, but we need to focus on that strategically, and how the question's a bit about today, how do we do that? As I mentioned earlier, the first mover advantage and driving investment in our supply chain is a little bit difficult, a little bit unusual, I think, around the, first of all, there's an awful lot of money that could be spent on it not to upgrade it, but to drive efficiencies through that. And then in terms of the first mover advantage that I mentioned, in fact, that the beneficiaries of much of the efficiency that's driven is not necessarily going to be the people that provide that investment. And that's a conundrum. That's a challenge. Certainly at a commercial level, if you're investing, you need a return, obviously. So that's where, as GTA at that industry strategic level, we looked at this and thought we really need to start focusing and getting some thinking going on about it. As Andrew mentioned, working on our supply chain, driving efficiencies adds value to every tonne of grain that moves through it. So, whether we focus on, a 7 million tonne market in Indonesia, or the prospects of India, or, a couple of million tonnes into Japan, that's all work that needs to be done and investment made in that. But investing in the supply chain and driving efficiencies through that will actually deliver the biggest bang for buck, I think, in terms of how we add value, drive efficiency, grow our industry, and provide better returns to farmers, and also better returns to people that have invested and operate in that supply chain. They're certainly entitled to a return on their investment and their activity. The challenges that we saw around this, and we'll expand on these during today, and that's really the purpose of today, is to run through those. But the supply chain evolving, I think, is an interesting one where, traditionally we've come from state-built asset infrastructure that has evolved, is now commercially owned and operated, but we're seeing many, many more supply chains. technology, it's just moving at a rate of knots. And I use the analogy of the original mobile phone. Those that can remember it, it was the size of a house brick. And now we've got a phone in our pocket that has more computing power than what put a man on the moon. So we need, as an industry, to make sure that we are keeping up with that. It would be a real shame, really a catastrophe if 5 years down the track, as an industry, we look back and go, oh my God, how did that happen? We didn't keep up with what was happening with us around the world, and making sure that we do that. We'll spend a bit of time today talking about storage assets, and as I mentioned before, the fragmentation that we've seen in our supply chain. How do we hold that together as an industry and instill the confidence in our consumers, in our customers, and our stakeholders? Because at the end of the day, the value of our industry really is the sum of the confidence that our consumers and our stakeholders have in our product. So that's a very important one, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on that today as well. And then finally, the skills and the capability piece is important. If you don't have the skills and capability, none of it's really going to work anyway. So that's where we got to. I think the way we sort of look at this is this modernising the grain supply chain. Think of it as an umbrella type of strategy where there's a number of things within it and below it that can fit and work within it. But at a high level, as an industry, we should be working towards doing that. Now, how does this strategy fit in terms of with the supply chain and GTA? I guess is an interesting one. And what way we've sort of looked at it, I've put up there a picture of our what I call self-regulatory framework, and where we have our technical committees. And as I mentioned, a lot of this came out of the issues that were being put on the table in the technical committee. So to an extent, it's really a member-driven strategy around trying to address these things. The modernising grain supply chain strategy, we've broken it into 4 strategic growth pillars. You can see there around skills, capability, quality and market access, technology, and also transport and logistics. And looking at those areas, and we'll focus a bit more on those, but I think they're the sort of the key buckets, if you like, for us to think about and how we improve those and reduce reputation risk for our industry. With our industry as an industry of exporters as well, it's very important that we engage with the government. And what you'll find today, and we're lucky we've got David Ironside in a second from the department to talk about where the government see things and where they're moving. But what I hope you'll see at the end of the day is there is a lot of alignment in our thinking and a lot of alignment in terms of where we think we need to get in the future around that. So I won't steal David's thunder, but I think it is important that we work with government, and wherever possible we can align our strategies, and it's really encouraging to see that we've had quite a few in-depth conversations with the government on these things and really starting to put some rubber on the road, I think, around those areas. And David will talk more about that. So the opportunities around technology, assets, site storage, and skills and technology is where we'll get to. But what I really want to sort of leave with, and I'll finish up here, is at the end of the day, today is about the concept and about the strategic direction that we see that we need to go in and try and get there. So to me, if at the end of the day, if there's nothing else, we've given you a taste of the concept and get you thinking around that. So think conceptually, strategically, obviously try and tie in the realities and the practicalities of that. It's all great to dream, but we at the end of the day, they need to be tangible, and then identify further challenges so that we can and bring them to us so that we can look at them and work on how we go with those. And at the end of the day, it is trying to make sure that we're aligned between as commercial entities, as an industry, and also with the government. So I'll leave it there. You can see, I think David has popped up there. So David Ironside, I'll just give a quick introduction. The Assistant Secretary for Plant Export Operations that Andrew mentioned. I think David's been in the role for a few years now, and he'll run through where the government's thinking, the Department of Agriculture, and some of the programs that they're about to undertake. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you all today. I think Pat, in his introductory remarks, made some really useful points, and I will come back to some of those as I go along. Probably just a bit of background first of all. So I am the Assistant Secretary for Plant Export Operations, which is within the Department of Agriculture, the part of the department which is responsible for making sure that when we certify that all plant products, so that's grain, horticulture, plus other things like logs and timber and nursery stock and a whole range of anything really derived from a plant, that when we export those things to other countries, that we are meeting their phytosanitary import requirements. So meeting the import requirements of the importing country. And that's an important consideration, and one that a lot of people don't, I think, even in industry, don't necessarily appreciate too much, is that just as Australia has quite strict quarantine import laws to protect our environment and protect the pest and disease status of our agricultural industries, other countries have the same thing. So it's our responsibility as the National Plant Protection Organisation, or the NPPO, that's recognised under the International Plant Protection Convention, for us to take that role seriously and make sure that when we're exporting stuff, plant-based products to importing countries, you know, those products meet the importing country's requirements. So in that way, I guess the focus that the industry has on the quality requirements of your buyers and your clients in other countries is kind of, I think, fairly closely aligned to the focus that the department has on making sure that the phytosanitary requirements of those importing countries are met as well. And in a lot of ways, even though the department does have a very regulatory role, and we enforce legislation that's set out under the Export Control Act and other acts from time to time, even despite that regulatory role, I'd see us in partnership with industry to try and make sure that the products that we send to our trading partners not only meet the individual buyer's quality requirements, but also the regulatory requirements of the importing country. And I guess that's a theme that I'd like to explore a little bit more over the coming minutes, just to give you a sense of where I think there is some alignment between what the department's doing, or where we're headed, and where GTA is headed with the work that's currently being done on standards, developing industry standards. So to go back a stage, I just want to tell you a little story that I think is pretty instructive, and some of you will have already heard this, but a lot of you won't have, and I think it's useful to help understand, for me anyway, how I came to kind of see the alignment between what our roles are as regulators and what industry does to satisfy your customers' requirements. So I've been in this job a bit over 3 years now, and not long after I was in the role, a person who was representing a fairly major bulk grain handler invited me to the opening of a new facility that they'd set up. And it was a pretty high tech facility, and they were very proud of it. And the opening was quite a gala event with people from the state government there, and others coming along to sort of take part in this official opening. And while I was there, I was talking to this guy who I knew from the company, and he was giving me a bit of a tour through the facility, and it was all very high tech and very impressive. And at one point we went into this room, and there were some folks there doing pretty advanced work on, the assessment of grain that was to be exported for things like, the hardness of the grain, the protein content, the moisture content. And it was explained to me that that's something that the customers are really focused on, because depending on how the grain's going to be used, that there are different requirements in those against those quality criteria for the parcels of grain, and that the exporter wanted to make sure that those criteria were met, and that there was what looked to me at least to be quite a large and pretty sophisticated effort being put towards making sure that parcel of grain that was going to that buyer met those requirements. And while I was looking at this, I thought, wow, we've got this guy in another room separately on that facility. We've got a guy working a grain sampling machine that puts a sample of grain from each consignment into a bucket. The bucket's then taken and sieved by this person, over manually sieved, so just poured into a sieve and shaken over a white top inspection bench, and then what falls out of it is inspected, visually examined by this person, and that's the phytosanitary inspection component. So I said to this guy, like, how hard would it be for the people who do this quality work that they're obviously doing in a very advanced and sophisticated way? How hard would it be to get them to do the phytosanitary assessment for this parcel of grain as well? And the guy said, "Oh, easy, you know, no trouble at all. They could do it on their ear." And I said, "Well, then why don't they? Why do we have a situation where they're doing all this kind of lab work on grain here, and that the department's requirements, so the phytosanitary stuff, gets done in a fairly old school, is probably the most polite way to describe it, this old school way in a different room?" And he says, "Because you require it." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." So essentially, because the department prescribes a way of that is, you know, that dates back to, well, at least the 1980s and possibly earlier, because the department prescribes a way of doing something that's not necessarily contemporary, not necessarily best practice, but because we prescribe it, industry will do it because that's the way it has to be done. And so that got me thinking about a range of things, and you know, how we really need to focus more on outcomes than on process as regulators. And at about the same time, we started working with internally. We had been working internally at about that same time, but later we started talking to industry about what was the kind of 10-year vision for the way that we as a department regulated plant exporters. And essentially, long story short, we came up with some ideas in the department. We tested them with our colleagues in operations division, who are the people who are out in the field doing the work for us. We found that their vision was actually pretty much the same as our own. And then we got in industry through our two industry consultative committees, our horticulture industry consultative committee and our grain industry consultative committee. We tested those ideas, and what we found, to my surprise and really delight, was that we were pretty much on the same page about all of our thinking. And what that resulted in was I haven't got a presentation, so I'll just hold it up the right way, perhaps. Right way, perhaps. This is all back to front, so it's very confusing. That's our plant export operations strategic plan for 10 years, and that was the document that Pat referred to a bit earlier. And the key things, there were 6 key themes that came out of that plan, and I think that those 6 key themes are really going to drive where we head for the next 10 years in terms of reform work, and building on that theme of focusing on outcomes and working in partnership with exporters to make sure that what we send to importing countries meets both their regulatory requirements and also their commercial requirements. But the 6 priorities that came out, or the 6 themes that came out of that strategic plan, were, first of all, to try to focus on building a better regulatory framework to allow for outcome-based solutions to the regulatory challenges that we've got. So that includes a whole raft of things, but doing things differently to focus not on having a prescribed process that everybody must follow to achieve an outcome, but rather looking at the outcomes that we need as regulators and helping industry through whatever system is appropriate to the entity that we're working with, helping them to kind of get to those outcomes. That also includes doing things to support industry better in doing the regulatory work. So one of the first things that we managed to kick off in the last couple of years was to put in place what we call our Regional Assurance Manager, or RAM initiative. So what that is 12 people around the country, 12 officers who work for the department, whose sole job is to really try to link up with authorised officers who do our inspection and assurance work in the field. We've got 1,400 authorised officers who do work on our behalf now, and those 1,400 are not employed by us. We do have the equivalent of about 8 internal staff who do that work now for us as well, but they're way outnumbered by the number of people who do the work for us who are industry based. And those people, as well as needing the training and the sort of accreditation testing that they've always had, and the annual or semi-annual audits that they've always had, we recognise that they need better support. So in the same way as our staff have a whole raft of options if they don't really understand a work instruction or don't know what to do, or are just a bit rusty on a particular skill because they haven't done it for a while, our staff always have someone they can call and ask for help. And what we recognised is that there was a really significant need for industry AOs to have that level of support. So we've tried to provide that through the Regional Assurance Manager process, which is now more than a year old. The second strategic priority that came out of the program that we identified was making sure that our people had the right sets of capabilities, and that's something that is going to be really important going forward, because the right capabilities in the future will be not the same as the right capabilities were in the past. For example, we're doing quite a bit of work at the moment on IT systems, so particularly the PEMS application that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. It's come a long way in a short period of time, and it's got a lot further to go, I think, particularly in terms of integration with the department's other export IT systems. But what it means is that within the program here, we need people with IT skills, but also with an understanding of how plant exports works as an industry, so that we can ensure that, as far as possible, the IT systems that we build meet the needs of industry and reflect industry practice. So we have tried to take on quite a number of people in the branch of late that have IT skills, just to kind of help us out in that space. And that's just an example, I guess, of us trying to work to that requirement to build capability in the right spots. The third area that we identified was about getting the law right, so making sure that we have effective and appropriate legislation to support the things we want to do. And if we want to be more flexible in the way that we achieve outcomes, which is kind of consistent with the things I said before, then we need legislation that allows for that. We don't need legislation that prescribes a particular way of doing a thing and limits people to that one thing. So on the 28th of March this year, the new Export Control Act came into force, and with that came revised plant rules. So the rules are like lesser laws that sit underneath the Act and actually give the detail that's not present in the Act about how we operate the export regulatory system for plants specifically. So in the new legislation, we have access to things like export licenses, which we've never used before in the plant space. We've got access to other tools like approved arrangements, which we kind of had in the past, but they were pretty limited in the way they operated. Under the new export legislation, there's a heap of flexibility that comes with an approved arrangement, and we can effectively enter into arrangements with industry entities who want to do regulatory things in a much more flexible way than we could in the past. So we haven't actually entered into any of those yet. The key thing initially was just get that legislation over the line, but they're regulatory tools that are now in the toolbox that we can use going forward. So related to all that was the fourth strategic priority, which was really around using better technology, and PEMS is a start in that space. And quite recently we've done an initiative that the guys are calling PEMS in your pocket. So I think it's the department's first mobile phone enabled application. So it's not an app as such. You can't download it from the App Store yet, but it works properly if you're doing it on a mobile phone. So allows authorised officers who are working the field to report the results of their inspections in a way that they probably couldn't do easily in the past. The fifth strategic priority that came out of that big series of workshops that we had with industry was around taking a more of a risk-based approach to regulation. So what that means is recognising where you've got very compliant entities who are on the ball and doing the right thing and delivering the outcomes that we need as regulators. Recognising that those entities are a lower risk and giving them a lighter regulatory touch to, number one, encourage compliance, because if people see that if you're compliant, we're in your face less, well, that's a good thing. But also for us to allow us to focus our resources on the entities in the supply chain that might be the highest risk, and they might be high risk because of the nature of what they do. And an example we saw there would be like, say, the people who do fumigations of logs. That has, in the past year, become very clear that that's an area of high risk just because of the nature of what they do and their importance in the supply chain. But also, entities can be high risk because they are non-compliant. So if an entity has a history of non-compliance, then that's the kind of entity that we want to be spending our time working with and focusing on, rather than those that know what they're doing and can demonstrate that they know what they're doing. So that's really what that risk-based approach theme is about. And the sixth and final theme that came out of these meetings we had with industry was really not so much about a goal, but about a way of getting to the goals, and that is the need to work with both industry and state and territory governments more closely to kind of the sort of management word of the day is co-design, and so that was kind of what we're talking about, is being able to co-design the things we do with the people that we regulate, so that we all agree on what the regulatory outcomes are that we're chasing, and we all agree on what's an appropriate way to get there. So what's the path that we want to go down? So that's essentially the key themes that came out of our strategic priorities that we put together. But those priorities will give us a bit of a roadmap for the next 10 years. And it was kind of just fortuitous that not long after we finished that work on the strategic priorities, the federal government, looking at ways to kickstart the economy after COVID, came along with a pretty substantial bucket of money for the department to help us modernise the way we regulate exports. So not specifically plant exports, but other commodities, meat, dairy, eggs, fish as well. But this bucket of money was really mostly about improving our IT systems, but also there was some of the funding that was specifically dedicated to plant exports to do some things to help us move towards those goals that we'd identified for 2030. So with that money, we've now set up a number of projects. One of them is, for example, to actually pull together a meeting with states and territories and look at where there might be regulatory overlap. So where are things that we both do, or where we could potentially move to mutual recognition of each other's systems. So that will be really useful and interesting. But one of the other bits, and this is the bit that really is probably most relevant to participants today, is around recognising industry systems where those systems deliver on the same kind of regulatory outcomes that we're chasing as the department. So when we started talking to Pat and others in GTA about this work, it was again fairly fortuitous that the GTA standards about asset management were being discussed and being thought about, and we talked about, well, is there scope if the standards were built in such a way, and if the standards were to cover off the kind of things that we would expect registered establishments to do, and to standards that we would expect registered establishments to meet to be registered, then if entities were complying with that standard and there was a way to check that they remain compliant with that standard, would we need to do audits on them as registered establishments? And the answer is possibly not. If we can get to a point where we agree that the industry standard meets the regulatory outcomes that we're trying to achieve as regulators, then we can apply that lighter regulatory touch to those entities that can demonstrate their compliance. And then thinking further in that vein, if there were elements to the industry standard that allowed or encouraged or required entities to do quality assurance in a way that covered off the way, the things we're worried about as regulators, so weed seeds, insects, other contaminants in grain going to countries to meet their the importing countries' phytosanitary requirements. If the standards could cover that off, then potentially you wouldn't even need to do the inspection and sampling in the way that we've historically done it using AOs anymore. So that kind of comes full circle back to the story I told at the start about where, if you've got entities that are doing their own quality assurance in a way that either does or potentially could meet the department's requirements for checking that a parcel of grain complies with the importing country's phytosanitary requirements, then why wouldn't we recognise that? That's something that could potentially mean that companies that want to take ownership and take responsibility for meeting those requirements themselves and do it in their own way, as long as they get to the same outcomes, why wouldn't we recognise that? So we've set up a bit of a project under the congestion busting initiative now. We have also brought back on contract Bill McGee, who was a person who worked in the grain and seed export program some years ago, and some of you may remember Bill. He's back on contract with us working on that project now to try to align the standards that we have and that the regulatory requirements that we're responsible for managing with the development of the GTA quality standards to as far as possible align those two things so that we can maximise the recognition that we give to companies who comply with those standards. Feels like I've been talking for a long time and you've probably had enough, so I might just stop. And I don't know, Pat, whether you want to do questions now or whether you want to leave it. I'm happy to hang around. I think you've got a panel session later on, so I'm happy to hang around and be part of that if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's really good. I think one of the things is this alignment with where the government's regulatory requirements are and with what industry is trying to do. I think that's the bit I see that we've got a lot of opportunity there. We had one question come in just on the chat there, and the questions to you, David. How much of Australia's export licensing system is still paper-based, i.e. physical paper travelling with containers and bulk shipments, and how much is purely digital? And I suppose there's you can probably talk about that for half the day anyway. But
I'll try not to.
Yeah.
I'll try and be brief. So look, the good news is COVID was our friend in this space, because when COVID hit and there was a massive reduction in the amount of air freight and airplanes flying around the world, it became obvious to everyone very, very quickly that getting paper phytosanitary certificates and other certificates around the world was going to be a lot harder. So during COVID, we were able to negotiate with most of our trading partners an agreement that they would accept scanned copies of original phytosanitary certificates as the basis for doing clearance of import consignments in their countries. So there've been some hitches with that. So some countries we've had to go back and remind them that that's the deal now, and there's still a few countries that don't way they want. A lot of our trading partners, a lot of our major trading partners, we have kind of gone digital, but in a very ad hoc way since about this time last year. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have been working for some time now on a digital way of exchanging certification between governments that's not so ad hoc and doesn't require exporters to scan a paper certificate and then email it to their client and then have that client present that to the importing country government. And that the new way is a project that's been developed by the IPPC, which is called eFITO. And eFITO essentially means the electronic exchange of plant health certificates between governments. So the department Australia has pretty much lagged a bit over the last 5 or 6 years in that space. We haven't kept up with other countries, and we've got other countries already doing it, participating in eFITO, but because really of I guess a concerted push from within this branch, and particularly from one of my staff members, Peter Namanis. Peter and I have been really pushing this hard. So we had a commitment made by the senior executive in the department to delivering eFITO for Australia by the end of calendar 2021. So hopefully when that comes along, we will pretty much see an end to the need, at least for most countries, to exchange paper certificates at all. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does, yeah.
Yep. Good morning all. Tim Ross from Grain Trade Australia. I'm here also just to assist with a few questions that have come through. And I've got actually one for you, Pat.
Ooh.
And the question really is, Pat, are you saying that GTA sees itself as having a role to play to fill in where there's market failure and where strategy is actually required and it's not being delivered?
Yeah, interesting question, Tim. I would hope it never gets to market failure. Is probably the first thing to say, but certainly I think there's a role to play for an industry association to look at things. So it's just natural. Everyone sort of gets a very blinkered view of their own business, and everyone's busy and focusing on how to do that. And I think one of the roles for GTA is a bit of not oversight, but looking at a level, at a strategic industry level around that. But that's going to be driven through the committees. And like I said, a lot of what we're talking about today was raised by committees, and those on the committees know that we sort of have this mantra, you try and leave your employer at the door and think about the industry needs and requirements. And that's where I think, GTA's role is probably to facilitate that as much as anything.
Oh, thank you, Pat. Just for the delegates also, obviously down the bottom of the screen, you've got options there to, as speakers doing their presentation, you've got an option down there to throw up some questions, and what we'll do is we'll monitor those during the summit, and we'll ask those at question times. Thank you.